When I was 13, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there they divorced, and my mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone, and my mother was currently out of state. Now this didn't worry me, as this was not the first time. I even came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying they'd gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was regularly leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and sit a few miles out of town, and I knew most of the people, if not by name, then by face enough to wave and small chat with them, and had never before been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television and had most of the lights on in the house, not because I was afraid, but because at 13, I wasn't concerned with electricity bills or saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party over the holiday, and about halfway into the movie, however, power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panicked daze, because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen, where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest, because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen, which leads directly into the living room, where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I had heard the noise, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started as slowly and quietly as I could make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman from playing hide-and-go-seek in the dark many times with friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything. It was like they were just moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror there was a dark silhouette standing in the archway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream, however I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from the hiding spot and ran down the hallway, and I believe the only reason I wasn't overcome was because the person who was chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children do when they're afraid, and I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time, as it was right off the side of the couch. When I was 10, I got a bird for my birthday. He was a blue-fronted Amazon, and I named him Boo because it was October and close to Halloween. Boo had a large iron cage, and it was kept in my room, despite the fact that Boo, like me, pretty much had the run of the house whenever he wanted. His information will become relevant later in the story. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turd knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked when the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked on it, if they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking and on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. It was low, quiet, and because of that, it was even more frightening. It wasn't like that maniac laughter, but as if they were genuinely amused. It was a laughter that really frightened me, and I started heavily, hysterically crying and looking around my room to figure out what I could do. That was when I realized Boo's cage would fit almost perfectly between the door and the wall of my closet. The cage moved quietly on the carpeted floor, but as I pushed it into place, it scraped against the door, and alerted whoever was on the other side that I was trying to barricade myself in, because suddenly they threw themselves at my door, and you could hear the sound of wood splintering and the door handle being twisted violently. Boo, who had been stirred by the movement awake, began literally screaming and flapping his wings. I might have screamed with him, but honestly, I don't remember screaming. I just remember being extremely scared. Terrified, I crawled under my bed and waited. Several minutes passed, and the person eventually stopped attacking my door. Boo continued screaming even after he had stopped. Though being under my bed gave me no feeling of being secure, I didn't come out from being under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid that he might expect that, and therefore be waiting for me on the other side, and it was also several feet off the ground, as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified for what felt like hours. I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up the next morning to daylight. The fear of what happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why, and scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there. I decided to crawl out the window and run to the neighbors since it was daylight outside, and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out a window is a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully, as I was not, and still am not, the most coordinated human being. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house, and that's when I noticed the back door was wide open. Scared, but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning instead of pitch black night, I walked up the back steps and went inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe on how stupid this could have turned out, and that I wish I could have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help, but thankfully, no one was inside my house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock of my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterwards. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door, and noticed the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been flipped. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, checked all the windows and front door, and then called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called the co-worker, who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. The main switch had been flipped. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, checked all the windows and front door, and then called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called the co-worker, who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on forward. I recently learned of some chilling details about a person that was heavily involved in my life as a child, and I thought I would share the story. Throughout my childhood, I was extremely shy and did not find myself going out of my way to make friends in new settings. I had recently started preschool at my grandmother's church, and I remember being on the playground playing by myself when a woman introduced herself to me. Her name was Candy, and she looked like any other sweet old woman. She almost reminded me of my own grandmother with her abundance of white curls on her head. Candy was a volunteer at the church and typically watched over the children while they played, so we would see each other fairly often. I can't remember much about the start of this friendship, but I presume one thing led to another before I was frequently spending time with her in and out of school. My parents were grateful to have someone who was interested in watching me, as I was the youngest of three, and my parents worked full-time while also taking my brother and sister to and from school, sports, or friends' houses, so having a helping hand was a blessing for them. To be honest, I don't remember too many details about spending time with Candy, but I suppose we spent our time frequenting ice cream shops, parks, etc. I do have one memory of going to her house, where I had never been before, and as she was showing me around, I remember passing through the dining room and seeing another little girl who looked to be around 10 to 12 years old. I do have one memory of going to her house, where I had never been before, and as she was showing me around, I remember passing through the dining room and seeing another little girl who looked to be around 10 to 12 years old. Candy introduced me to her and told me that she lived down the street and would spend a lot of time at her house. I'm not sure why, but I remember being jealous. I guess I was jealous that Candy also cared for and spent time with another little girl. I had never felt that way before, and I'm not sure why I remember that so clearly. For some reason, that was the only time I went to her house. Fast forward a few years, and I'm in the first grade. I had totally forgotten about Candy and had not seen her since I graduated preschool 2 years prior. My neighbors, who I carpooled to school with, had dropped me off at my house after school one day, and I spotted a Target grocery bag hooked onto our front door. I ran upstairs to my room, and to my surprise, there were several adorable, brand new outfits inside just for me. I immediately tried them on and was so excited to show my mom when she came home from work. After my mom got home, I eagerly showed her the outfits that Candy had left for me. Unfortunately, my mom was not as excited as I was. In fact, she was quite angry. She yelled at me to take them off and that she would be returning them to Candy. I was so confused as to why she was upset with me. What did I do wrong? These were free clothes, a gift. Wouldn't it be rude to return a gift to someone? To avoid being punished, I put the clothes back in the bag and handed them to my mother. We never spoke of this again, and Candy slipped my mind for the next several years. Once again, the thought of Candy slipped my mind, and I didn't remember to ask my mother about what happened until I was in college a few years later. We were saying goodbye to my grandmother after grabbing lunch when she mentioned to my mom that someone's funeral was that weekend. They then sat in silence for a few minutes, just staring at each other. After my grandmother left, I asked my mom who they were talking about, and she informed me about Candy's death. The realization that I had never heard the true stories about this woman crossed my mind, and I asked my mom about what my sister refused to speak on. My mother then proceeded to relay the horrible stories to me about the little old woman that tried to take me away from my family. At the beginning of the friendship, Candy genuinely was a big help to my family and was someone that they trusted. However, Candy's intentions were questioned by my grandmother, who shared a few of her concerns with my father after hearing some odd stories from her friends at church. She felt as though something was off with Candy, and she didn't like that I spent so much time with her. Coming from a woman who had never had any negative things to say about anyone, my father became slightly wary of Candy, but he assumed that my grandmother was just being overly cautious. After some time of Candy watching over and babysitting me, her demeanor changed and she started acting possessive of me, became hostile towards my parents. She would show up unannounced to our house asking for me, and if I wasn't there, she would become incredibly angry and yell at my parents about how awful they were. She would continuously tell them that they didn't deserve me and only she was worthy of taking care of me. This happened several times before my parents told her to stop coming to the house or they would call the police. This inclined her to start calling the house and leave messages for me, which my parents obviously would not tell me about. In these voicemails, she would cry to me and try to convince me to leave with her and leave my family. She would talk about how awful my parents were and how she could give me a much better life than they could. The voicemails that were intended for me soon turned to threats from my parents. She threatened to call the police or child services to have me removed from the home and placed into her care. She threatened to tell the police about my parents' violence and abuse towards me and my siblings, none of which was true. Once she realized that her phone calls were not working, she began making efforts to show up at the house again. She started by driving up and down our street day after day. She would ask our neighbors, and then the neighbors' children, if anyone knew if I was home or where I was. She would park her car and watch our house without anyone really noticing or saying anything. Eventually, our neighbors began recognizing her car and what was going on, and they would inform my parents when she came around asking about me. After some time of doing this, she took it upon herself to come to the front door while only my brother, who was likely only 12 years old at the time, and I were home, and she started banging on the door, begging to see me. My brother opened one of the front doors, keeping the storm door between them closed, and told her to leave. She proceeded to plead with him to let her in, and he replied that I was not home, despite me napping soundly upstairs. Candy partially forced herself through the door when my brother put his hand in her face, pushing her out of the door, and told her that the police had been called. She left after that and distanced herself for a while before she encountered in the final straw with my mother. One day, my mother and I were backing out of the driveway to attend a birthday party when Candy pulled in behind our car, blocking us from leaving. She came up to the window, and my mother rolled it down, ready to tell her off for good. Candy ignored her and looked right past my mother into the back seat where I was sitting. She said to me, "Wouldn't you rather come with me and never see your mom again? I love you so much more than they ever did, and can give you everything you want if you come with me." This was the final straw for my mother. She never thought she would be upset or fight with an old woman, but the day had come when it was absolutely necessary. She screamed and yelled at her, making sure to include the fact that Candy would regret the day that she ever came into contact with me or my family again. Something that she said must have really scared Candy, because she drove off and didn't appear in our lives until the Target bag incident. I'm not sure how I never knew that any of this happened and never thought anything was weird about her when I was a child. I guess my parents did a good job of shielding me from the horrors of the situation. After hearing about everything that took place, I assumed that there must have been a reason she became so obsessed with me. Did she not have her own family? Did she lose children or grandchildren and wanted to find someone to fill the void? According to my mother, she had several children that were much older than me, as well as young grandchildren. Thus, I'm not sure what would have sparked her interest in me. Thankfully, we no longer have to worry about her. Part of me still wonders if I repressed any memories or conversations with her that were upsetting. Did she ever privately talk to me about how awful my parents were or how she wanted to take me away from my family? Did I ever agree to leave with her? I also wonder if as I grew older and joined social media like Facebook, did she ever search my name? Did she ever watch me when I was in middle school, high school, or even when I went away to college? I have so many questions, but I'm glad that we never had to find out if she was going to follow through with any of her threats. So some backstory. I'm a volunteer firefighter in a very small town in West Virginia, and have been so for just over 3 years, being 16 when I joined and 20 years old now. Our station was built in 1974, and since then, there have been a total of 8 deaths of members of the department, 2 since I've been there. We lost 2 great men in March of 2018 in the line of duty in a fire truck wreck. In the fire truck that was wrecked, there are 2 seats in the front. In between them is the motor of the truck. Directly behind the front seats are 2 more seats that face out of the back of the truck on either side of the motor. There are also 2 seats in the middle near the rear of the cab that face out of the front. Our chief at the time, who retired now, was driving the truck that day in March. Assistant chief, who passed away, was in the hot seat, passenger seat. Lieutenant, also dead, was in the officer seat, which is the rear-facing seat on the passenger side. Chief engineer was in the rear-facing seat on the driver's side, and one of our younger firefighters, who was 17, was in the middle seat facing out of the front. Anyone who has knowledge of the fire service or fire trucks will know that this type of engine is called custom. Our assistant chief and lieutenant that were on the passenger side of the truck were both killed in the fire truck when it went off the road and hit a rock outcrop on the side of a mountain. They were killed instantly. Everyone else survived, 2 with serious, life-threatening injuries and the other with a broken arm. I told you that to tell you this. This is not my story, but my former fire chief who was driving the truck that day. One day, Chief was asleep on the couch in our station when he was woken up by a former chief telling him to wake up because we had a call. Chief awoke and saw no one around. There was no radio traffic, and the siren on the building was silent. Thinking it was a dream, he went back to sleep. After around 30 seconds, he was awoken to our station tones going off and the dispatcher coming across the radio saying that our station had a structure fire. The weirdest part about this is that the former chief that woke him up had died in 1996. This story took place in 2007. Now, knowing that the station is haunted, not by bad spirits, but spirits of our fallen brothers, I get a lot of comfort knowing that when I go on calls, they're watching over us all. We even leave a spot open for them on the trucks when we roll out. So now on to my story. On the night of Halloween 2019, me and one of our probationary members were at the fire station, upstairs in our pool room. We were sitting at the pool table, and I was helping him study to take his Mod 1 test the next evening. We were the only people in the building at this time at night. While studying, the nighttime officer in town texted us and asked us to come down and let him in to get a snack from the vending machine. We both went down, and while we were talking to him, there was a break in the conversation where the building was silent, except something broke through the silence. When we came downstairs, we had left all the pool balls in the pockets on the table and the cover on the table. Form downstairs, We started hearing the pool ball clacking against each other as if someone had started a game of pool, but we were the only ones in the building, and there was no other way for someone to get in other than the door that we were standing in front of. When we walked upstairs, officer with us, we searched everywhere in the upper level of the building to find nothing but the cover of the pool table on the floor and the ball scattered across the table as if someone had started a game, even though no one had touched it. I know it was one of the guys who hang around the station in the afterlife, but it's still just a little eerie, knowing that they are there and can play pranks on us to intentionally scare us. I guess I should also clarify in my experience at the station, I think it was the 2 guys that died in the crash I mentioned earlier. They were both very big pranksters. When I was 15 years old, my mom owned a convenience store in a city with a pretty high crime rate. Our apartment was on the superior level of the store. She asked me to help her at the store a few times a week, and I agreed. My sister wasn't very helpful with the family business. She was never home, so I had to give a hand to Mom. On my first day at the store, a middle-aged man, skinny, with bad posture, entered in the store. My mom greeted him, but he didn't respond and just kept walking while looking on the ground. I've never encountered someone before who had a vibe like his. His self-esteem was so low it was making me uncomfortable. Eventually, he got to the cash register, put his stuff on the counter, lifted up his head to look at me, and I'll always remember what he told me. "Oh wow, hello. I love you and Catwoman," with the biggest smile and a tone that reminded me of Ace Ventura. I was like, "Excuse me?" He said, "Halle Berry," while making a wink. I didn't know what to do. He was so weird and creepy, so I just stared back at him in shock. My mom laughed and said that he's always making jokes like that. She even called him sweet. I faked a laugh and rang up in a complete silence. Then he said I made his day and left. I looked at my mom and asked her, "What the fuck was that?" She said not to worry about him, that he's a regular, and he's a little weird, but he's nice and likely has some sort of mental illness. I felt bad for judging him. I wouldn't like to be in his shoes. The following evening, I received a friend request on Facebook, and yes, it was him. I probably shouldn't have accepted it, but I was curious and I didn't want to be rude. I was very naive and scared of people not liking me back then. I started a chat conversation with him to ask how he found my name, and he wrote that he heard my mom calling me by my name, so that a man heard my first name and managed to find me on Facebook. I didn't even have a job listed on my profile. How long did that take him? And more importantly, why was he so devoted about contacting me? He asked me if I had a boyfriend. I'm a lesbian, but I left out that information and I just said no. He wrote that I was pure and that I probably needed a teacher. Mental illness or not, I was really creeped out at that point, so I made up an excuse and left the conversation. I didn't want to tell my mom because I was scared that she would be mad at me for accepting the friend request. The following day at school, I started getting more and more chat messages from Mr. Catwoman fan that we'll call Greg. He was asking me creepy stuff, like what I like in a man, how I imagine my first time, if I touch myself, etc. He talked to me about his pet turtle and asked me if I'd like to pet it. I don't know if there was a second level here, but I remember that I replied yes. I thought that if I showed some interest in non-sexual stuff, he'd drop it. The school day was over and I was exiting the building, about to get on my bus, when someone behind me poked on my shoulder. I turned around, and guess who it was again? It was Greg. I was petrified when I saw him. He said, "Ooh, hey, Turtle Peter, I'm here to pick you up." I was so confused at that moment. I asked how he knew that I went to that school, and he said he saw me this morning getting on the bus, and that he was trapped behind it for the whole way to school. Right, more like he was following me. I was looking for my friends, but saw no one around that could help me. I said that I already had my ride home taken care of, and he insisted that I had to go to his place and pet his turtle. I said I really couldn't and walked away quickly. I turned back at some point, and he wasn't there. Relieved, I finally took that bus and went back home. After dinner the same day, I went to my bedroom like I always did. I still said nothing about my stalker to anyone. I was so ashamed of myself because I thought I was the one who put myself in this situation, and he messaged me again. But this time, he was a completely different person. He started calling me slurs and saying I had no idea the immensity of joy he could have given me if I wasn't such a bitch who only cared for the N-word. I remind you, I was 15. He ended up telling me bitches like me deserve to get raped and die, and he threatened to kill my mom if I blocked him. I was crying in my room, scared to death. I'm so mad at myself for not having told my mom. 2 days later, during which I kept receiving threats and sexually inappropriate messages from Greg, I had my second shift at the store. At least I had not seen him following me anymore, but the threats were enough to make my life hell. I was so anxious about my shift because I was sure that he would show up, and of course, he did. I was about to close, and no one else was there. Not even my mom was upstairs because she was at her sister's place for the evening. I begged her to stay to supervise me, but she said that I was competent enough to be alone in the store. So he entered and went straight to me with a huge smile on his face and said, "Wow, what's Halle Berry doing here not petting my turtle?" He didn't look angry at all, like he was during those texts. He looked genuinely happy to see me. I couldn't handle it and started crying. I don't even remember which nonsense he told me next. It was in his usual cartoon-esque tone, which scared the fuck out of me. That's when I remembered about the panic button hidden under the counter. I hit it, hoping that the cops would soon come. He was speaking nonstop and faster than usual while making big gestures, and I swear to God, it's like this man was in a trance. He took one of our chocolate bars, unwrapped it, and started eating it while telling me how much of a bad boyfriend he's been before, but that now he found Jesus. He needs to prove himself to me, and that he's changed forever. Apparently, I had been chosen by Jesus himself for Greg to pass some test. That's when things got even worse. He asked if I wanted to be his girlfriend, and of course, I said yes to protect myself. He calmly replied, "I know it's not true," in a very serious tone, unlike his usual one. He stared at me for what seemed like an hour before completely switching to rage, like someone turned on a switch in him. It was completely insane. He took another chocolate bar, put it next to my face, and said, "You think that this shit matters?" and repeated the same thing with various items from the counter, aggressively squeezing my arms or shaking me. I thought I was losing my mind. It was like a nightmare. I kept crying while the rest of my body was frozen. I couldn't process what was going on. I have no idea of the point he was trying to make. He just went on and on and on with no conclusion. He was really just being aggressive. Thank God that's when the cops came in. They saw what was going on. It wasn't very hard, and they handcuffed him. Long story short, I told everything about Greg to the police, and they told me that Greg was under parole, so they sent him back to jail since he broke his conditions. The officer confirmed to me that he's suffering from a severe mental illness, and that he wouldn't be surprised if he had stopped taking his meds. They called my mom to the police station, and she was in tears. She was sad that I didn't trust her enough to tell her what was going on. Needless to say, that she never let me be alone in the store anymore. A year later, my mom lost her business and we moved in another city. It wasn't the main reason why we moved. I'm so glad that we did, as I won't have to worry about him. He got out of jail 3 years ago. I can't imagine how it would have been like if I were still back, living in that old home, working at that old business. This incident happened to me when I was 17 years old. It was around 3:37 in the morning. I was watching anime on my phone when my friend, who we'll call Brian, called me around that time and asked me to come over to his house. I asked him why, but all he said was that I should just shut up and come over to his place as quick as I could before hanging up the call. So in the next few minutes, I was thinking of an escape plan. As I was going down the stairs slowly, I picked up the keys to the main door, and as I was unlocking the door, I could hear the sound of someone laughing from just outside the door. It was a very faint, but really terrifying and sinister laugh. But I still thought that I must have been imagining it, since I was so paranoid of being caught by my dad. So, I opened the front door and went to open the main door. While I was trying to find the keys to the main door, I heard that laugh once more. This time, I knew for a fact that it was real. I was so terrified even by the idea of some strange person standing near my house in the middle of the night and laughing that I dropped my keys on the floor. I was so terrified that I froze like a statue. I wanted to run away, but it was as if my body refused to move. Even now, thinking about the incident is giving me chills. The next thing I remember was that my father slapped me on my cheek and asked me what the hell was going on. But I didn't say any word and just kept standing like a statue. Then again, my father shook me by my shoulders and asked me again. I ended up bursting into tears. I was crying and told him everything that had happened. Next moment, he took out my cricket bat and opened the door and checked outside, but there was no one to be found. My dad came back in and asked me if I was lying to him about all of this. I then took out my phone to show him my call history, but there was no call from his number. I was shocked about what had just happened now. I was so shocked, confused, and terrified at the same moment that I threw my phone on the ground and ran inside my room where I started to cry. Minutes later, my mom came in and asked me if I was telling the truth. I convinced her that I wasn't lying and it was all true. She then asked me to get some sleep because I had exams in the morning. I tried to sleep but I couldn't. Then, at around 5:30 in the morning, my dad came in and said it was time for me to get up or I'd miss my exam. I got up and got ready and was waiting at the table for my breakfast when my dad came to me and asked me to forget all about what had happened that previous night. As he said, I could have just imagined everything about that someone who was standing near our house in the middle of the night and laughing. He said that it could have been sleep deprivation, but I know that I wasn't imagining those things. It was all too real to imagine. The story took place 12 years ago. I'm a 26-year-old female, but I was around 14 years old at the time when this happened. Minnie was my best friend. We were both the same age and both freshmen in high school. Val was around 10 or 11. We spent so much of our time together, and at this point, I was spending the night at her house almost every weekend. Minnie and her family lived in a mobile home park not far from my house. This mobile home park was absolutely beautiful and very well kept with several different little parks throughout it. The biggest out of all these parks is in the very back and had a big playground with lots of swings, a basketball court, and a tennis court. So basically, there was a lot of things to do and we always felt safe walking around without an adult. But of course, you can never escape creepy and unusual people. I should also mention there was one house that everyone agreed the family was strange, and there was always sketchy looking people coming and going from that house. As we got older, we realized the son of the couple was a drug dealer. This particular day was a Friday, and I don't remember why, but her school had a half day, so we got out early. I would be staying at Minnie's place until Sunday morning, so we were both incredibly excited. After being on the computer for a while, we got bored of being inside, so Minnie, Val, and myself decided to go to the big park. We told their dad where we'd be going and set off to the park. The big park was not far from their house and only took a minute or two to get there by walking. Minnie and Val decided to stop by other houses first so we could get more girls to come hang out. By the time we got to the big park, there was about 15 of us girls ranging from the ages of 9 years old to 14. We were at the park for a couple of hours playing different games and whatnot when I noticed this guy. He didn't look that old, maybe in his 30s, but he was very dirty and from his appearance seemed homeless. I can't remember his face that well, but what I do remember is that the top of his nose, which is close to the eyes, was really crooked. He wasn't someone who had been seen there before, so we all focused on him. He was a couple of 100 feet away from us, and the way he was acting had us all freaked out. Now as an adult, I now know that he was probably high on something and tweaking out pretty hard, but my 14-year-old self had no idea. He was standing in one spot, but was moving and contorting his body while making weird-ass noises. We were all at the playground just staring at this guy, too scared to move, when he goes quiet and just turns his head towards us. Even though none of us were moving, I just felt like this was when all of us stopped breathing. He then starts making his weird noises again, and then just starts yelling out, "Girls, pretty girls." He then starts moving towards us, and one of the other girls screamed, and we've all had enough at this point, and start running in the same direction. We all ran down a different street than the one we came on. Even though we were scared, Minnie and I were the older ones in the group, and watched the rest of the girls run to their homes. I kept looking behind us to see if the guy was following us, and I never saw him. After everyone else was home, Minnie and I ran to her house. Val had already ran home with her friend that lived next door. When we got back home, Val had already told her dad about the scary man at the park. He questions us about the incident, then calls a friend of his who lives near the park we were at. According to his friend, he heard the guy making his weird noises and saw him scaring us, so he scared the guy off by threatening to call the police. Before I continue, I want to mention that Minnie's room is in the front of the house, so her window faced the street. We soon put the incident behind us and resumed sleepover activities. Minnie's parents stocked up on junk food, sodas, and even bought a few round table pizzas for us, so this was a big deal. We had been watching movies, playing video games, talking about boys, and in general doing the typical sleepover shenanigans before everyone had a smartphone. It was now around 10:30, and we were being quite loud, so Minnie's mom comes in to tell us to be quiet. Not long after quieting down, I start feeling uncomfortable. Not to sound generic, but I had a strong feeling of being watched. Minnie had a big queen-size bed in her room, and the bed was against the wall with the window. Her window had blinds, and some sheer curtains both were closed. Not long after quieting down, I start feeling uncomfortable. Not to sound generic, but I had a strong feeling of being watched. Minnie had a big queen-size bed in her room, and the bed was against the wall with the window. Her window had blinds, and some sheer curtains both were closed. The three of us are on her bed watching a scary movie. I can't remember what movie we were watching, but it was adding to my anxiety. I asked Minnie and Val if they were feeling like they're being watched, and they said no, and not to be scared, as it's just a movie. Roughly 15 more minutes passed, and I'm still trying to calm myself down, when suddenly, we hear what I can describe as the squeaking sound made when you rub your hand down a wet window. We all looked at each other scared shitless. Val was next to the window and whispered it wasn't her, and that the sound came from outside. She slowly moves away from the window. Minnie quickly gets the courage and says she'll look out the window, and it was probably just the neighbors. I'm directly behind Minnie because I'm curious. She leans forward and pulls down one of the blinds. What we see makes us both scream at the top of our lungs. Just like out of a horror movie, there is a face looking back at us. Since it was already dark, we couldn't really see the rest of the face, only the eyes and the top part of the nose, and it was crooked. It was the guy we saw earlier. He stays at the window for a few seconds, laughing, and we all jump off her bed and run into the living room, screaming the whole time. Minnie's parents rush out, asking what happened, and we all do our best to tell them while still screaming and hyperventilating. "It was him, the guy from the park," I kept repeating to their mom as their dad ran outside. After this, I don't remember much. I only remember being so scared and crying. I think the cops were called, but I don't know if they ever caught the guy. After this incident, Minnie and Val were too scared to sleep in their own rooms and slept on the floor of their parents' room. I was also too scared to go over, so we didn't have our sleepovers for a long time after that. I know this may not sound that bad, but I now have a legit fear of looking out windows at night. I used to wonder how he found us, but since we were being loud as fuck and Minnie's room faced the street, it's possible he heard us. I have no idea how long he'd been standing outside her window, just watching us, and I kinda don't want to know. Minnie and I haven't talked about this since it happened, and sadly, she's moved out of the area, so we don't talk much. I was taking an Uber home one morning, and I tend to make small talk with my drivers if they seem nice. I'd rather talk than sit in silence, as I find it painfully awkward. This one morning on my ride home, I was talking with a man in what I'm guessing would be his late 50s. We made small talk about going for walks. I've recently started enjoying going for long walks for my mental health, and was giving him suggestions for some routes he could take. Anyways, the conversation seems harmless, and we begin to talk about work. I was careful not to tell him where I work, but I guess he must have clued in while I was talking about what I do for work. When we pull up to the house, he begins to tell me that he knows where I live, where I work, and where I go for walks. I'm hoping it was maybe just him trying to teach me a lesson to be more careful with my information through a harmless conversation, but it wasn't. That's truly scary. The man knows exactly where I live. Needless to say, I don't speak to my Uber drivers anymore. Just a quick hello and thank you. Last week I had the weirdest dating experience in my life. Just to put everything into context, I'm not crazy about the online dating thing, but I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship and figured why not. I end up matching with this gorgeous woman who I'll refer to as Daisy. Daisy and I start talking, and at first, she seems really cool. We eventually decide to meet up at a spot near her, roughly an hour away from where I live. Finding a parking spot took longer than expected, so when I finally arrive, I'm thinking I'm going to have to apologize for being late. Unfortunately, I see that Daisy is nowhere to be found. To add insult to injury, all my texts and calls go unanswered for the next 10 minutes. This, in turn, leads to the assumption that I've been stood up. Annoying, but not the first time it's happened. Just as I'm about to leave, I see her rounding the corner in a stunning outfit. She's every bit as beautiful as I envisioned, which probably helped me forget the poor communication just seconds prior. Daisy explains that one of her friends was having an issue, and she needed to be there to calm her down. We continue on with the date, and everything seems cool. Daisy was a lovely girl, and we vibed the whole time. The only snag was her mentioning how she was looking for a father for her baby boy. Up to that point, she hadn't said anything about children, something that I, respectfully, am not looking for. I still have a lot to figure out in my own life, and I'm not just in a place where I feel comfortable being an adult figure in a child's world. I informed her that I wasn't the best person to be around children, and she just kinda laughed it off. She gave me a whole spiel about how I'd actually be great with kids and how I needed to trust myself. Then she went on to explain how the right woman would somehow bring out the father in me. Weird, but whatever. I asked if she was still close to the baby's dad, which leads to a tangent about how she thought she could make him into the perfect man, but he was too resistant to change. When asked more about this, she simply referred to trying to make all the pieces fit in his life a certain way, but ultimately, he couldn't be molded into what she wanted. Seeing that this was headed towards a toxic place, I opted to change the subject and continue on with the night. By the time 11 o'clock rolled around, I was feeling exhausted and decided to head home. After saying our goodbyes, I got to find my car, but before I even get in, I see it's been vandalized. The headlights were smashed in, my tires slashed, and one of my windows were broken. Oddly enough, nothing was stolen. It just appeared as though someone had taken their anger out of my vehicle. Right as I'm about to call roadside assistance, I hear someone yelling my name. Lo and behold, Daisy just so happened to be driving right past. Unprompted, she decides to pull into the parking lot, and she immediately notices the damage. After inspecting my car for a few moments, she suggests that we go back to her place to hang out for a bit, and she can take me back after. At first, I was reluctant, but after looking at Uber and Lyft prices and hearing a convincing argument from Daisy about how bad Uber is in the area, I agreed. I got everything squared away with having my car towed, and we headed off to her apartment. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was how clean everything was. There wasn't a speck of dust or item out of order. When Daisy turned on the TV, it was already set to Netflix, and a bowl full of snacks was neatly placed on the table. It appeared as though she were expecting company. But what I found the oddest was that there was no babysitter. What good parent leaves a baby completely unattended for hours at a time? When I asked about this, she simply laughed it off and made a comment about her son, how he was too good to need someone to watch him, and how she didn't trust others in her home. Definitely weird, but I didn't necessarily feel comfortable lecturing her about how to raise her own kid. Before picking a movie, she asked me if I wanted to meet her son. Internally, the answer was absolutely not, but she was my free ride, so I opted for the most awkward "sure" I'd ever given. She disappeared into another room with a giddy scream and soon returned with a young boy wrapped in a blanket. She was whispering something to him, and with a loving smile, invited me to come over and say hello. I did as I was told and walked over to greet the baby. I went to peel back the blanket on what should have been a sleep-eyed young boy, but my immediate reaction was to jump back and yell when, to my horror, I was met with the most disgusting face of a decrepit porcelain doll. Its single eye rolled back into its skull, and a fat roach seemed to have its home in there, located at the dislocated mouth. The once white skin was stained black, and various cracks ran on its head. For a moment, I genuinely thought this was some kind of horrible prank, but the look of love and acceptance on Daisy's face was authentic. She eyed the doll like any mother would their child, and the soft kisses she gave it solidified the fact that it didn't register what she was holding wasn't a human. She gave me a big smile and asked if I thought her boy was beautiful, and I couldn't even form a proper reply. I just fumbled my way into asking if I could use the bathroom. Instinctively, I locked the bathroom door behind me and splashed some water on my face, trying to sober myself up from this nightmare. When the reality of the situation hit, I stood there for minutes trying to think up of an excuse for myself as to whatever the hell was going on. My thoughts, however, were interrupted by the sound of a soft yet persistent crying noise. Thinking it was Daisy coming to check on me, I unlocked the door and cranked it open slightly, but I didn't see anyone in her room. Curious, I cautiously made my way out of the bathroom, trying to keep as silent as possible, and followed the source to a walk-in closet. Preparing myself for the worst, I took a deep breath and slowly cracked open the door, where I was greeted by seemingly nothing. The only thing inside seemed to be a CPR dummy torso. Multiple pairs of differently shaped arms and legs were strewn about, along with various parts of unorganized clothing. For a moment, I thought that I was hearing things, or that it was our neighbor coming through the thin walls. But suddenly, what I thought was an inanimate torso quickly turned his head towards me, let out a loud gasp for air, and shouted, "Help me! Oh God, please help me. I'm in so much pain." The shock and horror at the fact that this horribly disfigured person was alive nearly put me on my ass as I scrambled to slam the closet door shut. But it was too late. The man screaming had already alerted Daisy, and I could hear her inquiring about what was happening from the other room. It was now or never. I burst down the hallway, pushed past a waiting Daisy at the door, and made my way outside, sprinted down the dark street until I physically couldn't go any longer. The last thing I heard was Daisy running after me, screaming, "Come back, please. Our baby needs you. We'll die without you." The sound of her voice slowly died out, and the moment I felt she was no longer coming after me, I called an Uber and sat in their car in silence the rest of the way home. As soon as I arrived, I called the police and explained everything that went down that night. The next day, I tried to get a follow-up on what exactly had happened. To my shock, I was told that they found absolutely nothing. Just a woman who was living alone by herself. No kids, no torso in the closet, nothing. I didn't know how to take that information. I still don't. I know what I saw, and if Daisy is still out there hurting people, I don't know if I can live with the fact that she's free to meet other people and do horrible things to them. I would have assumed that the story ended there, but just the other night, I got a phone call. It was Daisy. She told me that "our kid" said his first word. Apparently, it was my name. She said that she loved me, and that both she and the boy missed me dearly. And then, silence. The next day, I found a postcard in the mail that read, "Soon, we're going to be looking at daycare. Thinking of finding one closer to you so that your commute for work is easier. Looking forward to seeing you soon. With love, Daisy." I never once mentioned where I live, and I'm terrified of what this means for me. If any of you are doing the online dating thing, please hear me out. Make sure that you're really, really damn careful about who you choose to connect with. That choice might stick with you forever. This happened in the summer of 2008, I think. I was at a sleepover birthday party at my friend's house. That's going to require some explanation. I live in rural western Pennsylvania. All you need to know about that side of the state is that if you aren't living in Pittsburgh and Erie, you're probably living in an oil town that went bust decades ago. Oh, and you're probably isolated in a forest somewhere too. My family did okay in spite of the economically depressed area we lived in. Now, my friend had money. His family weren't Wall Street investors or anything, but in a town like mine, it was noticeable. He had a huge house, a huge yard, a treehouse, a trampoline, big screen TVs everywhere, and every video game console ever. You might think I was only friends with this kid because of all the stuff he had, but honestly, that isn't true. He's probably in the top 5 nicest people I've ever met. His family is also amazing. They took me in for a while when my mom was in the hospital once. I still keep in touch with them. So, rich guy, good guy, etc. He had a lot of friends. His birthday buddies were pretty legendary among kids in our town. Usually, they involve one of those closed canopy tents outside with movie projectors inside, along with a soft serve ice cream machine and a slushie machine. The party in 2008 was a little more low-key. There were a few less people than normal, and there weren't any tents and projectors. We played video games for the first part of the night, and then started to play flashlight tag when it got dark. I know the rules to flashlight tag can vary depending on who's playing. My friends and I used to play it like a group hide and seek. The hiders would go hide in the dark, sometimes alone and sometimes together if there was a great spot. The seekers got the flashlights and also some cool walkie-talkies. As I said before, the yard we played in was huge and there was a lot of places to hide. The first hour or so was pretty uneventful. We mostly hid around the treehouse as well as climbing some of the trees inside the yard itself. The only thing we had to worry about was the cop when it drove by. Obviously, we weren't doing anything illegal, but we just didn't want to explain why we were sneaking around the house at 11 o'clock at night with flashlights. My friend's yard ends in some pretty thick woods. My own house, which is a couple miles down the road, has some wooded areas around it as well, but not like this. After you leave my friend's backyard, there is about 15 to 20 miles of wilderness before the next town. He does have neighbors on one side, and all of this is going to become important in a little bit. On this particular time, I was one of the seekers. My group and I were waiting in the house for the other group to hide. We were mostly drinking slushies and messing around. We had just come out of the house and started search when we heard a lot of yelling. Suddenly, the entire other group came rushing back to the house. They went inside, and my group, really confused at this point, followed them in. It took a few minutes for everyone to calm down and explain what was happening. The story went like this. That round, they had all decided to hide back in the woods since we hadn't been back there yet. They'd gone a number of paces inside but were still in sight of the house. Looking farther inside the woods, they caught sight of a figure at the edge of their vision. It took them a while to figure out what they were looking at in the dark. They thought it might be a tree or a deer or something, but they kept focusing on it. When they were sure what the shape was, that being a human, they started yelling and sprinted back to the house. When everyone was finally inside and mostly settled down, I was freaking out along with some of the other boys. A few of the people in the group, including my friend who was throwing the party, were skeptical. They were pretty sure that the other group was just trying to scare us. In fact, my friend was almost angry about it. He was going to march off to the woods to check the situation out himself. They stopped him and said that they should only go back to check as a group or to wake up his parents who were asleep upstairs. Most of the people who hadn't gone into the woods actually found this to be pretty fun in a weird way. It was like being in a thriller movie. Plus, we were in a low-crime neighborhood, and there were enough of us that one unarmed person shouldn't have bothered us. Even if it was a hoax, it would be fun to scare. We came up with a plan to investigate the woods. The majority of the guys decided to go back in the woods with flashlights and walkie-talkies. They also planned to bring my friend's dog, but that didn't work out. The dog was a golden retriever collie mix and was the furthest thing from a guard dog, unless you feared being licked to death. He also got most of his exercise by fetching tennis balls in the big yard, so he was not used to being let on leash. I waited at the house with another scaredy cat kid with the other walkie-talkie, ready to wake my friend's parents up or call the cops. I wasn't taking the situation very well, but didn't really show it. I tend to seem pretty calm on the outside, but I'm usually a nervous wreck on the inside. I at least attempted to calm the other scaredy cat down. After a few minutes and some excited chatter on the walkie-talkie, the investigators returned in a similar state as the original first group. There was a lot of shouting and it took a few minutes to get the story straight. This is what happened to them. They had gone to the edge of the woods like the original first group had done. It took a few minutes of searching since the figure had been spotted in thicker brush that wasn't easy to reach. One of the kids had swung his flashlight around until he caught sight of something before yelling and running back to the house. Some of the other boys, who had gotten the same glimpse inside the flashlight beam, behaved similarly. They confirmed that they'd seen a person. He was mostly obscured behind a small tree. The features that they could make out from him that were a brief moment were that he was a male and he was on the taller side with longish hair. One of the boys who had seen him thought he might have been wearing a light flannel. Apparently, he had made no move to approach them and had just cocked his head out a little to stare them down out from behind the tree. It was at this point that my friend's mom finally came downstairs after all the commotion. We explained the situation to her. Afterwards, she locked all the doors and told us to stay inside and to tell her if we see anything. She explained that the part of the woods we were going into was probably not their land anyway. They had just the closest house to it. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. We were situated on air mattresses in my friend's game room. The really frightened kid actually took to sleeping underneath one. Just before sunrise, I finally drifted off for a few hours of sleep. When I came to, everyone else was awake and eating pancakes on the patio. My friend's mom was with him. She had checked the woods that morning and had not seen anything amiss. We were all a little on edge, but things were pretty normal besides that. When my parents came to pick me up, I was reminded of the fact that I only lived about 2 miles from my friend's house. It was a walk that took 10 minutes or less. Even at home, I struggled to sleep for a while. I just kept thinking of how easy it would be for the man in the woods to show up at my yard. Fast forward a couple of weeks later, I'm playing video games at my friend's house again. I bring up the subject, but he was very dismissive of it. It was strange, but he was really pretty short with me. It was like he wanted me to drop it. None of his behavior fit his normal personality at all. He did come up with a short explanation though. Apparently, one of his neighbors had a son a few years older than us. He was tall with long hair. My friend explained that he could be a jerk and was pretty weird. The way he said weird may have indicated that he had some sort of mental condition. My friend's explanation was that this kid had seen us playing and hid in the woods to try to scare us. That did make me feel a little better at first. It did seem reasonable on the surface, and there's a good chance that's actually what happened. However, there are a few things that don't sit right with me. In my experience, when someone is trying to scare you, there is a haha I got you moment at the end. Like most people want to reveal that the whole thing was good-natured, or they just want to show how dumb you look after nothing. Back when we had our sleepovers in the tents, one of my friend's older brothers would rustle the outside before popping in to see if he had scared us. This person in the woods did nothing like that. He may have been trying to scare us, and went all in on the whole thing, wherein his only pleasure was knowing that he had scared us for life. Or, if this kid really did have problems, maybe he just didn't understand how pranks typically went. His explanation also brought back an old memory of mine. I had been going to my friend's house for close to 10 years at that point. In one of the early years, I remember playing a game with my friend and one of his neighbors who lived across the street. Both my friend and the neighbor had crab apple trees in their yards. We played a game of basically dodgeball with moldy apples thrown across the road. The game ended when the neighbor, who was a few years older, chucked the apple at my friend's head as hard as he could. It absolutely nailed my friend, and he was on the ground crying. I brought him inside where his parents asked me what was wrong. I told them about the game and the neighbor kid. When he had finished crying, his parents scolded him and said that they had warned him about this. They just said that the neighbor kid was not nice. For the record, he didn't have long hair, but this was a number of years prior to the incident. Now, I don't know if this was the neighbor that my friend had pinned the blame on, which brings me to some other disturbing things. My friend never gave me the suspect's name, even when I pressed him on it. More unsettling was the fact that my friend was not among the kids who had actually seen the guy directly. This was just his explanation for what happened. I don't think my friend was actually trying to cover up anything. I think he was just worried that I wouldn't come to his house anymore if I didn't feel safe. That was the last time I had a sleepover at my friend's house. That wasn't really because of the incident, but because we were entering high school, and overnight parties started meaning something else entirely. My friend's explanation does seem plausible, and that makes a pretty creepy story on its own. The alternatives are even more frightening. I don't even want to think about what kind of guys go stalk teenagers in the woods in the middle of the night. This happened over 10 years ago when I was in my early 20s, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was living in Japan at the time, so it was pretty normal to see people doing the whole cosplay thing. I'd see people dressed up as characters and dressed differently, but this was something else. I was out one night with a friend, having a few drinks, just the usual dinner and booze, at an Zake lounge. Back then, it was pretty normal for me to either walk home or taxi home after midnight, since the train stopped operating around 12:30 a.m. to 1 a.m. This was the case for many people that enjoyed the nightlife. It would often be pretty busy in the streets around that time. This particular night, my friend wanted to go clubbing with some of our other friends, but I had a pretty early morning start, so I decided to walk home. I lived about a 25-minute walk from the area that we were at drinking. I often took a few shortcuts through some alleyways to get home quicker. As I turned the corner of one of the alleyways, I was face to face with a guy wearing a clown face paint, but more like the Joker. As I mentioned it was pretty normal to see people like this cosplaying and dressed differently, so I walked past him with a smile and kept walking. As I passed him, I noticed he had some blood on his clothes, which made me feel a little uncomfortable, but I kept walking. That's when I realized he had started following me. I even made some unorthodox turns into different streets to try and get away. I walked faster, but he kept following me. I turned around and asked him if he was okay and if he needed help. That's when he put a big smile on his face, started giggling, and pulled out a kitchen knife. I got freaked out, so immediately turned around and started running away from him. He then burst out in a screaming laugh and started skipping towards me. As I started running fast, he too then started running fast. As I was running away from him, I can still hear him giggling and running towards me. I was running for about 3 minutes when I noticed a small construction site with a garbage on the side of it. I saw one of those metal rods used in construction, and I quickly picked it up and turned around and yelled at him. We both came to a complete stop. He saw me with the metal rod and stopped running. I yelled at him and swung the metal rod once and told him I will hit him if he stepped closer. That's when he stopped. I started walking backwards to make sure he wasn't following me. After about a block of me walking backwards, he was just standing there. I turned around and started running home. I will never know if he was just trying to scare me or if he was actually a psychopath trying to kill me. Either way, it was one of the creepiest things to ever happen to me.